Welcome to the channel. Thanks for stopping by. In this video, you will hear the original version of Aladdin and the 40 Thieves. Originally titled, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. This version is as accurate to the original fairy tale as possible. It is not the storyline of a romanticized animated cartoon, but the original context and original version you probably have not heard before. If you enjoy this video, remember to click the like and subscribe button, plus turn on the notification bell. If you do that, we promise to give you some of the greatest stories and fairy tales by the greatest authors. Also, we would like to hear in the comments what you think of this video. You can also name your favorite author or story and it will be included in another video. Enjoy the video. There once lived, in a town of Persia, two brothers, one named Sesame and the other Alibaba. Their father divided a small inheritance equally between them. Sesame married a very rich wife, and became a wealthy merchant. Alibaba married a woman as poor as himself, and lived by cutting wood, and bringing it upon 3 asses into the town to sell. One day, when Alibaba was in the forest, and had just cut wood enough to load his asses, he saw at a distance, a great cloud of dust, which seemed to approach him. He observed it with attention, and distinguished soon after, a body of horsemen, whom he suspected might be robbers. He determined to leave his asses to save himself. He climbed up a large tree, planted on a high rock, whose branches were thick enough to conceal him, and yet enabled him to see all that passed without being discovered. The troop, who were to the number of 40, all well mounted and armed, came to the foot of the rock, on which the tree stood, and there dismounted. Every man unbridled his horse, tied him to some shrub, and hung about his neck a bag of corn, which they had brought behind them. Then each of them took off his saddlebag, which seemed to Alibaba from its weight, to be full of gold and silver. One, whom he took to be their captain, came under the tree in which Alibaba was concealed, and making his way through some shrubs, pronounced these words, "Open, Sesame." As soon as the captain of the robbers had thus spoken, a door opened in the rock, and after he had made all his troop enter before him, he followed them when the door shut again of itself. The robbers stayed some time within the rock, during which Alibaba, fearful of being caught, remained in the tree. At last the door opened again, and as the captain went in last, so he came out first, and stood to see them all pass by him. When Alibaba heard him make the door close by pronouncing these words, "Shut, Sesame," every man at once went and bridled his horse, fastened his wallet, and mounted again. When the captain saw them all ready, he put himself at their head, and they returned the way they had come. Alibaba followed them with his eyes as far as he could see them, and afterwards stayed a considerable time before he descended. Remembering the words, the captain of the robbers used to cause the door to open and shut, he had the curiosity to try if his pronouncing them would have the same effect. Accordingly, he went among the shrubs, and perceiving the door concealed behind them, stood before it, and said, "Open, Sesame." The door instantly flew wide open. Alibaba, who expected a dark, dismal cavern, was surprised to see a well-lighted and spacious chamber, which received the light from an opening at the top of the rock, and in which were all sorts of provisions, rich bales of silk, stuff, brocade, and valuable carpeting, piled upon one another, gold and silver ingots in great heaps, and money in bags. The sight of all these riches made him suppose that this cave must have been occupied for ages by robbers, who had succeeded one another. Alibaba went boldly into the cave, and collected as much of the gold coin, which was in bags, as he thought his 3 asses could carry. When he had loaded them with the bags, he laid wood over them in such a manner that they could not be seen. When he had passed in and out as often as he wished, he stood before the door, and pronouncing the words, "Shut, Sesame," the door closed of itself. He then made the best of his way to town. When Alibaba got home, he drove his asses into a little yard, shut the gates very carefully, threw off the wood that covered the panniers, carried the bags into his house, and ranged them in order before his wife. He then emptied the bags, which raised such a great heap of gold as dazzled his wife's eyes. And then he told her the whole adventure from beginning to end, and, above all, recommended her to keep it secret. He bade her to keep the secret, and he would go and bury the gold. "Let me first measure it," said his wife. "I will go and borrow a measure off someone, while you dig the hole." So she ran to the wife of Kasim and borrowed a measure. Knowing Ali Baba's poverty, the sister was curious to find out what sort of grain his wife wished to measure. She artfully put some suet at the bottom of the measure. Ali Baba's wife went home and set the measure on the heap of gold, and filled it and emptied it often, to her great content. She then carried it back to her sister, without noticing that a piece of gold was sticking to it, which Kasim's wife perceived directly, whilst her back was turned. She grew very curious, and said to Kasim when he came home, "Kasim, your brother is richer than you. He does not count his money, he measures it." He begged her to explain this riddle, which she did by showing him the piece of money, and telling him where she found it. Then Kasim grew so envious that he could not sleep, and went to his brother in the morning before sunrise. "Ali Baba," he said, showing him the gold piece, "you pretend to be poor, and yet you measure gold." By this Ali Baba perceived that through his wife's folly, Kasim and his wife knew their secret. So he confessed all and offered Kasim a share. "That I expect," said Kasim, "but I must know where to find the treasure. Otherwise I will discover all, and you will lose all." Ali Baba, more out of kindness than fear, told him of the cave, and the very words to use. Kasim left Ali Baba, meaning to be beforehand with him, and get the treasure for himself. He rose early next morning, and set out with 10 mules, loaded with great chests. He soon found the place, and the door in the rock. He said, "Open, Sesame." And the door opened and shut behind him. He could have feasted his eyes all day on the treasures, but he now hastened to gather together as much of it as possible. But when he was ready to go, he could not remember what to say, for thinking of his great riches. Instead of Sesame, he said, "Open, barley." And the door remained fast. He named several different sorts of grain, all but the right one, and the door still stuck fast. About noon, the robbers returned to their cave, and saw Kasim's mules roving about, with great chests on their backs. This gave them the alarm. They drew their sabers, and went to the door, which opened on their captain, saying, "Open, Sesame." Kasim, who had heard the trampling of their horses' feet, resolved to sell his life dearly. So when the door opened, he leapt out and threw the captain down. In vain, however, for the robbers with their sabers soon killed him. On entering the cave, they saw all the bags laid ready, and could not imagine how anyone had got in without knowing their secret. They cut Kasim's body into 4 quarters, and nailed them up inside the cave, in order to frighten anyone who should venture in, and went away in search of more treasure. As night drew on, Kasim's wife ran to her brother-in-law, and told him where her husband had gone. Ali Baba set out to the forest in search of Kasim. The first thing he saw on entering the cave was his dead brother. He put the body on one of his asses, and bags of gold on the other 2. He drove the 2 asses with gold into his own yard, and led the other to Kasim's house. The door was opened by the slave Morgiana, whom he knew to be both brave and cunning. While unloading, he said to her, "This is the body of your master, who has been murdered, but whom we must bury, as though he had died in his bed. I will speak with you again, but now tell your mistress I am come." Ali Baba offered Kasim's wife to live with him and his wife, if she would promise to keep his counsel and leave everything to Morgiana, whereupon she agreed. Morgiana meanwhile sought an apothecary and asked him for some lozenges. "My poor master," she said, "can neither eat nor speak, and no one knows what his distemper is." She carried home the lozenges and returned next day weeping, and asked for an essence only given to those just about to die. The day after, Morgiana went to an old cobbler near the gates of the town, who opened his stall early. She put a piece of gold in his hand, and bade him to follow her with his needle and thread. Having bound his eyes with a handkerchief, she took him to the room where the body lay. She pulled off the bandage, and bade him to sew the quarters together, after which she covered his eyes again and led him home. Then they buried Cassim, and Morgiana his slave, followed him to the grave, weeping and tearing her hair. The 40 thieves, on their return to the cave, were much astonished to find Cassim's body gone, and some of their money bags. "Are certainly discovered," said the captain, "and shall be undone if we cannot find out who it is that knows our secret. 2 men must have known it. We have killed one, and we must now find the other. To this end, one of you who is bold and artful, must go into the city dressed as a traveler, and discover whom we have killed, and whether men talk of the strange manner of his death. If the messenger fails, he must lose his life, lest we be betrayed." One of the thieves started up, and offered to do this, and after the rest had highly commended him for his bravery, he disguised himself, and happened to enter the town at daybreak, just by Baba Mustafa's stall. The thief bade him good day, saying, "Honest man, how can you possibly see to stitch at your age?" "Old as I am," replied the cobbler, "I have very good eyes, and will you believe me when I tell you that I sewed a dead body together in a place where I had less light than I have now?" The robber was overjoyed at his good fortune, and giving him a piece of gold, desired to be shown the house, where he stitched up the dead body. At first Mustafa refused, saying that he had been blindfolded, but when the robber gave him another piece of gold, he began to think he might remember the turnings, if blindfolded as before. This means he succeeded. The robber partly led him, and was partly guided by him. Right in front of Cassim's house, the door of which the robber marked with a piece of chalk. Then, well pleased, he bade farewell to Baba Mustafa, and returned to the forest. Afterwards, Morgiana was going outside. She then saw the mark the robber had made. Quickly guessed that some mischief was brewing, she fetched a piece of chalk and marked 2 or 3 doors on each side, without saying anything to her master or mistress. The thief, in the meantime, told his comrades of his discovery. The captain thanked him, and bade him to show him the house he had marked. But when they came to it, they saw that 5 or 6 of the houses were chalked in the same manner. The guide was so confounded that he did not know what answer to make. And when they returned, he was at once beheaded for having failed. Another robber was dispatched, and having won over Baba Mustafa, marked the house in red chalk. But Morgiana being again too clever for them, the second messenger was put to death also. The captain now resolved to go himself. But wiser than the others, he did not mark the house, but looked at it so closely that he could not fail to remember it. He returned, and ordered his men to go into the neighboring villages and buy 19 mules. And 38 leather jars, all empty except one, which was full of oil. The captain put one of his men, fully armed, into each, rubbing the outside of the jars with oil from the full vessel. Then the 19 mules were loaded with 37 robbers in jars. They reached the town by dusk. The captain stopped his mules in front of Ali Baba's house. He then said to Ali Baba, who was sitting outside in the fresh air, "I have brought some oil from a distance to sell at tomorrow's market, but it is now so late that I know not where to pass the night. Unless you will do me the favor to take me in." Though Ali Baba had seen the captain of the robbers in the forest, he did not recognize him in the disguise of an oil merchant. He bade him welcome, opened his gates for the mules to enter, and went to Morgiana to bid her to prepare a bed and supper for his guest. He brought the stranger into his hall, and after they had eaten supper, went again to speak to Morgiana in the kitchen. The captain went into the yard, under pretense of seeing after his mules, but really went to tell his men what to do. Beginning at the first jar and ending at the last, he said to each man, "As soon as I throw some stones from the window of the chamber where I lie, cut the jars open with your knives, and come out, and I will be with you in a trice." He returned to the house, and Morgiana led him to his chamber. She then told Abdallah, a fellow slave, to set on the pot to make some broth for her master, who had gone to bed. Meanwhile her lamp went out, and she had no more oil in the house. "Do not be uneasy," said Abdallah, "go into the yard and take some out of one of those jars." Morgiana thanked him for his advice, took the oil pot, and went into the yard. When she came to the first jar, the robber inside said softly, "Is it time?" Any other slave but Morgiana, on finding a man in the jar instead of the oil she wanted, would have made a lot of noise, but she, knowing the danger her master was in, bethought herself of a plan, and answered quietly, "Not yet." She went to all the jars, giving the same answer. She now saw that her master, thinking to entertain an oil merchant, had let 38 robbers into his house. She filled her oil pot, went back to the kitchen, and, having lit her lamp, she then went again to the oil jar and filled a large kettle full of oil. When it boiled, she went and poured enough oil into every jar to stifle and kill the robber inside. When this brave deed was done, she went back to the kitchen, put out the fire and the lamp, and waited to see what would happen. In a quarter of an hour, the captain of the robbers awoke, got up, and opened the window. As all seemed quiet, he threw down some little pebbles, which hit the jars. He listened, and as none of his men seemed to stir, he grew uneasy, and went down into the yard. On going to the first jar and saying, "Are you asleep?" he smelt the hot boiled oil, and knew at once that his plot to murder Alibaba and his household had been discovered. He found all the gang was dead, and, missing the oil out of the last jar, became aware of the manner of their death. He then forced the lock of a door leading into a garden, and climbing over several walls, while making his escape. Morgiana heard and saw all this, and, rejoicing at her success, went to bed and fell asleep. At daybreak Alibaba arose, and seeing the oil jar still there, asked why the merchant had not gone with his mules. Morgiana bade him look in the first jar and see if there was any oil. Alibaba asked what had become of the merchant. "Merchant," said she, "he is no more a merchant than I am." And she told him the whole story, assuring him that it was a plot of the robbers of the forest, of whom only 3 were left, and that the white and red chalk marks had something to do with it. Alibaba at once gave Morgiana her freedom, saying that he owed her his life. They then buried the bodies in Alibaba's garden, while the mules were sold in the market by his slaves. The captain returned to his lonely cave, and firmly resolved to avenge them by killing Alibaba. He dressed himself carefully, and went into the town, where he took lodgings in an inn. In the course of a great many journeys to the forest, he carried away many rich stuffs, and much fine linen, and set up a shop opposite that of Alibaba's son. He called himself Courtyard Hassan, and as he was both civil and well dressed, he soon made friends with Alibaba's son, and threw him with Alibaba, whom he was continually asking to sup with him. Alibaba, wishing to return his kindness, invited him into his house and received him smiling, thanking him for his kindness to his son. When the merchant was about to take his leave, Alibaba stopped him, saying, "Where are you going, sir, in such haste? Will you not stay and sup with me?" The merchant refused, saying that he had a reason, and on Alibaba's asking him what that was, he replied, "It is, sir, that I can eat no victuals that have any salt in them." "That is all," said Alibaba. "Let me tell you that there shall be no salt in either the meat or the bread that we eat tonight." He went to give this order to Morgiana, who was much surprised. "Who is this man?" she said, "who eats no salt with his meat?" "He is an honest man, Morgiana," said her master, "therefore do as I bid you." But she could not withstand a desire to see this strange man, so she helped Abdallah to carry up the dishes, and saw in a moment that Courtyard Hassan was the robber captain, and carried a dagger under his garment. "I am not surprised," she said to herself, "that this wicked man, who intends to kill my master, will eat no salt with him, but I will hinder his plans." Morgiana, while they were at supper, determined in her own mind to execute one of the boldest acts ever meditated. When Abdallah came for the dessert of fruit, and had put it with the wine and glasses before Alibaba, Morgiana retired, dressed herself neatly, with a suitable headdress, like a dancer, girded her waist with a silver gilt girdle, to which there hung a poniard, with a hilt and guard of the same metal, and put a handsome mask on her face. When she had thus disguised herself, she said to Abdallah, "Take your tabor, and let us go and divert our master and his son's friend, as we do sometimes, when he is alone." Abdallah took his tabor, and played all the way into the hall before Morgiana, who, when she came to the door, made a low obeisance by way of asking leave to exhibit her skill, while Abdallah left off playing. "Come in, Morgiana," said Ali Baba, "and let Cogia Hussein see what you can do, that he may tell us what he thinks of your performance." Cogia Hussein, who did not expect this diversion after supper, began to fear he should not be able to take advantage of the opportunity he thought he had found, but hoped, if he now missed his aim, to secure it another time, by keeping up a friendly correspondence with the father and son. Therefore, though he could have wished Ali Baba would have declined the dance, he pretended to be obliged to him for it, and had the complacence to express his satisfaction at what he saw, which pleased his host. As soon as Abdallah saw that Ali Baba and Cogia Hussein had done talking, he began to play on the tabor, to which Morgiana, who was an excellent performer, danced in such a manner as would have created admiration in any company. After she had danced several dances, with much grace, she drew the poniard, and holding it in her hand, began a dance in which she outdid herself, by the many different figures, light movements, and the surprising leaps and wonderful exertions, with which she accompanied it. Sometimes she presented the poniard to one breast, sometimes to another, and oftentimes seemed to strike her own. At last, she snatched the tabor from Abdallah with her left hand, and holding the dagger in her right, presented the other side of the tabor, after the manner of those who get a livelihood by dancing, and solicit the liberality of the spectators. Baba put a piece of gold into the tabor, as did also his son, and Cogia Hussein, seeing that she was coming to him, had pulled his purse out of his bosom to make her a present. But while he was putting his hand into it, Morgiana, with a courage and resolution worthy of herself, plunged the poniard into his heart. Ali Baba and his son, shocked at this action, cried out aloud, "Unhappy woman!" Exclaimed Ali Baba, "Are you mad? Why did you kill our noble guest?" "It was to preserve, not to ruin you," answered Morgiana. "For see here." She opened the pretended Cogia Hussein's garment, and showing the dagger, "What an enemy you had entertained," she said. "Look well at him, and you will find him to be both the fictitious oil merchant, and the captain of the gang of 40 robbers. Remember, too, that he would eat no salt with you. And what would you have more, to persuade you of his wicked design? Before I saw him, I suspected him as soon as you told me you had such a guest. I knew him, and you now find that my suspicion was not groundless." Ali Baba, who immediately felt the new obligation he had to Morgiana, for saving his life a second time, embraced her. "Morgiana," he said, "I gave you your liberty, and then promised you that my gratitude should not stop there, but that I would soon give you higher proofs of its sincerity, which I now do, by making you my daughter-in-law." Then addressing himself to his son, he said, "I believe you, son, to be so dutiful a child, that you will not refuse Morgiana for your wife. You see that Cogia Hussein sought your friendship with a treacherous design, to take away my life, and if he had succeeded, there is no doubt, but he would have sacrificed you also to his revenge. Consider that, by marrying Morgiana, you marry the preserver of my family and your own." The son, far from showing any dislike, readily consented to the marriage. Not only because he would not disobey his father, but also because it was agreeable to his inclination. After this, they thought of burying the captain of the robbers with his comrades, and did it so privately that nobody discovered their bones till many years after, when no one had any concern in the publication of this remarkable history. A few days afterward, Ali Baba celebrated the nuptials of his son and Morgiana with great solemnity, a sumptuous feast, and the usual dancing and spectacles. He had the satisfaction to see that his friends and neighbors, whom he invited, had no knowledge of the true motives of the marriage, but that those who were not unacquainted with Morgiana's good qualities commended his generosity and goodness of heart. Ali Baba did not visit the robber's cave for a whole year, as he supposed the other two, whom he could get no account of, might be alive. Year's end, when he found they had not made any attempt to disturb him, he had the curiosity to make another journey. He mounted his horse, and when he came to the cave, he alighted, tied his horse to a tree, and approaching the entrance, pronounced the words, "Open, Sesame." And the door opened. He entered the cavern. And by the condition he found things in, judged that nobody had been there since the captain had fetched the goods for his shop. From this time he believed, he was the only person in the world who had the secret of opening the cave, and that all the treasure was at his sole disposal. He put as much gold into his saddlebag as his horse would carry, and returned to town. Some years later he carried his son to the cave, and taught him the secret, which he handed down to his posterity, who using their good fortune with moderation, lived in great honor and splendor.